The morning Leona Marsh turned 18, the fluorescent light above her bed in Cottage 7 flickered 3 times and went out. She lay there in the sudden dark, listening to the hum of the ventilation system and the distant sound of a sprinkler turning slow circles in the yard outside. She had been awake for an hour already, watching the gray light gather on the ceiling, feeling the particular stillness of a day that was supposed to mean something. It did not feel like freedom. It felt like the moment before a door closes behind you and you hear the latch click and understand that the click is permanent. She dressed in the dark. 2 duffel bags sat packed at the foot of her bed, the same bags she had carried into Clearwater House 4 years ago when the state of California moved her from the group home in Modesto. Everything she owned fit inside them with room to spare. Clothes that were almost right. A sketchbook, nearly full. 4 paperback novels with broken spines. And at the very bottom of the smaller bag, wrapped in a clean white sock, a photograph she had carried since she was old enough to understand what photographs meant. It showed a woman in her 60s standing on a porch she did not recognize. The woman had white hair pulled back loosely, strong hands, and a smile that looked like it had survived something difficult and come out the other side steadier than before. On the back, in careful cursive, Dorothy. That was all. Just the one word. And below it, a date from 22 years ago. Leona did not know much about Dorothy Calloway. What she knew, she had assembled from fragments over many years. A name on a form, a single photograph. The information that Dorothy had been her mother's mother, that she had lived somewhere in Northern California, and that she had died 3 months ago, quietly, in a county hospital, without anyone there to hold her hand. The state had been notified, the paperwork had followed. And this morning, on the exact day Leona aged out of the system, she was scheduled to receive whatever Dorothy had left behind. She picked up her bags and walked out of Cottage 7 for the last time. The administrative wing of Clearwater House smelled the same way it always had, like carpet cleaner and old coffee, and the particular staleness of rooms where difficult conversations are conducted by people who have learned to conduct them without flinching. Ms. Patricia Wren was already at her desk when Leona arrived, a woman of 50 with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the careful, practiced expression of someone who delivered hard news regularly and had built a professional distance from it without losing the ability to see the person on the other side of the desk. She gestured to the chair. Leona sat. There was a folder on the desk. Beside it, a manila envelope, old and soft at the edges, with Leona's full name written across the front in the same careful cursive she recognized from the back of the photograph. Ms. Wren opened the folder first. The words came in the order Leona expected. Transitional Housing Fund, Job Placement Resources, the County Shelter List. She had read the pamphlets twice already. She knew the statistics. She was not afraid of them exactly, but she held them in her chest like stones she had been carrying long enough that she no longer noticed their weight. Then Ms. Wren set down her pen and folded her hands. There is one other thing, she said. She explained it slowly, the way she explained everything. Dorothy Calloway had died without a formal will in the legal sense, but she had filed a notarized deed of transfer with the county of Siskiyou 14 years ago to be held in trust until Leona reached the age of majority. The deed had been sitting in a law office in Redding, waiting for this exact morning. She slid the envelope across the desk. Leona opened it. Inside was the deed, dense with legal language, and a smaller envelope beneath it. In the smaller envelope, a ring of keys on a worn leather fob. 2 keys total, one modern and one old. Heavy, made of brass that had gone dark with age. And beneath the keys, a stack of bills, mixed denominations, held together with a rubber band. She counted it later. $411. The deed was for 72 acres of undeveloped land in Shale Pass, Siskiyou County, California. The county assessor valued it at approximately $8,000. There were no structures listed, no utilities, no road access beyond a fire road that was technically unmaintained county property. Ms. Wren let her read. Then she said, there is a standing offer. A company called Vidian Terra had been trying to acquire land in the Shale Pass area for several years. They had submitted a formal offer of $18,000 for the parcel. The offer was current. It had been renewed 3 times, most recently 6 weeks ago. $18,000, Ms. Wren said carefully, is a real sum of money for someone in your position. Leona looked at the deed, then at the keys. She turned the brass one over in her hand. It was heavier than it should have been. The teeth were unusual, longer than a standard house key, the bow stamped with a small geometric pattern she did not recognize. "What is this key for?" she asked. Ms. Wren shook her head. The law office didn't know. It was included with the deed when it was filed. Whatever it opens, it's on the property. Leona looked at the photograph of Dorothy. She looked at the name written on the envelope in that careful hand. Then she looked at Ms. Wren. "I want to see it," she said. Ms. Wren's expression shifted in a way that was not quite surprise and not quite disappointment. It was the expression of a woman who had hoped for a different answer and had taken the time to prepare herself for this one. "Leona," she said, "it's a 400-mile bus ride. The land itself has no value beyond the offer price. You have $400 and no place to live." "I want to see it," Leona said again. She kept her voice level. She had learned early that the surest way to lose an argument in a room like this was to let any emotion into it. Emotion gave people something to manage. Quiet gave them nothing to work with. Ms. Wren held her gaze for a long moment. Then she reached for her pen and began signing the release forms. The bus north left Fresno at 6 in the morning. Leona was the third person on it. She put her bags in the overhead rack, took a window seat, and watched the city give way to the outskirts, then to the flat agricultural land of the Central Valley, the orchards and the irrigation channels, and the long straight roads running to horizons that never quite arrived. She did not sleep. She was not tired in the way that leads to sleep. She was tired in the way that comes from years of low-grade alertness, the kind of tiredness that is structural, built into the architecture of a life where you have learned never to fully relax, because relaxing is a thing you do in places where you are allowed to stay. And she had never been anywhere she was allowed to stay. She read the deed twice more. She looked at the assessor's map included with it, a photocopy of a topographic survey that showed the parcel as an irregular shape on the eastern slope of a ridge north of a small town. The map showed a fire road accessing the property from a county road and a small square marked in pencil near the northern boundary. No label, just the square, and beside it in faint pencil, a notation she had to hold the paper at an angle to read. It said, P.W. She did not know what that meant. She turned it over in her mind for a while and then set it aside. By noon, the valley had given way to the foothills, the terrain beginning to bunch and rise, the oaks thickening along the creek beds. By late afternoon, they were climbing into the mountains proper, the road narrowing, the sky getting bigger and bluer and cleaner than any sky she had seen from a city window. The air outside the bus looked different up here, as if it had more substance to it, more actual content. The second day, the landscape turned serious. The pines came in dense and dark on either side of the highway, the mountains showing their age in the gray granite faces of the cliffs, in the way the rock had fractured and slid and stayed where it landed over uncountable years. She ate from a bag of food she had packed and watched the country change, and thought about Dorothy Calloway standing on that porch with her strong hands and her smile that had survived something. She thought about the fact that Dorothy had known she existed, had known for 18 years, had left her something specific, something that required a key, something with a handwritten label in a trust filed at a county office and renewed 3 times by the people who had been watching the land. She thought about the brass key with its unusual teeth and its stamped geometric pattern. On the morning of the third day, the bus came into Shale Pass. It was barely a town. The road descended into a narrow valley, and then the valley widened slightly, and there were buildings on both sides of the road. Not many, a gas station with pumps that looked like they had been installed decades ago and were still working. A hardware store with a hand-lettered sign, a post office the size of a large closet, and a general store with a covered porch where 2 older men sat in wooden chairs in the morning cold. The bus stopped in front of the general store. Leona was the only one who got off. The cold hit her immediately. It was May, and it was cold, the air thin and bright, carrying the smell of pine resin and something mineral underneath, rock and snowmelt and old earth that had been undisturbed long enough to develop its own particular character. She stood on the gravel with her two bags and listened to the bus pull away behind her, and then there was just the wind and the creak of the wooden porch, and the sound of the men in their chairs shifting slightly to look at her. She went inside. The store was dim and crowded with inventory, shelves floor to ceiling, canned goods and hardware, and work clothes and dried food and fishing tackle, and seed packets all arranged in a system that had the logic of long habit. Everything in the place it had always been, because that was where it belonged. A wood stove in the back corner was putting out steady heat. The smell was coffee and pine resin and machine oil. Behind the counter was a man in his late 60s, thick through the shoulders, with a white beard trimmed close and reading glasses on a lanyard around his neck. He looked up when she came in and did not immediately say anything, which she appreciated. He waited. She set her bags down and approached the counter. "My name is Leona Marsh," she said. "I'm looking for a piece of land north of town. The Callaway parcel." The man behind the counter was quiet for a moment. He set down the pencil he had been holding. "Callaway," he said. He said it the way you say the name of someone you have not thought about in a while, but have not forgotten. Taking it down from wherever it had been kept, checking its weight. "Dorothy Callaway was my grandmother," Leona said. "She passed away in February. She left the land to me." The man looked at her steadily. He had pale blue eyes behind the reading glasses, eyes that had seen enough to be neither easily impressed nor easily alarmed, eyes that were taking their time with her. "Name's Corwin Alderman," he said. "My family's run this store going on 53 years. I knew Dorothy. Not well, not the way you'd know a neighbor in town. But I knew her." He came around the counter and looked at the deed when she held it out, not touching it, just reading it where she held it with a careful attention that suggested he understood documents and what they meant. "She came in here once every few weeks for supplies," he said. "Kept to herself, paid cash, never caused trouble and never asked for anything she didn't need." He paused. She had her ways of knowing things, Dorothy did. Things about this valley, about what was happening here and who was behind it. He looked up from the deed and met her eyes. She chose to stay quiet about most of it. Didn't mean she forgot. "What things?" Leona asked. He looked at her a moment longer. Then he went back behind the counter. "You'll find out, I expect," he said. "If you're going up there, there's things on that land that'll tell you more than I can." He gave her a hand-drawn map of the fire road and told her it was a 5-mile walk from where the pavement ended. He told her the road was rough and that the last mile was steep. He told her there was an old structure on the northern end of the property, a line shack of some kind, and that it had been empty for as long as anyone in Shale Pass could remember, which was a long time. He also told her something else. "Vidian Terra," he said, packing the words into his mouth like something with a bad taste that he had learned to manage. "They've been working this valley for going on 6 years now, buying parcels. Sometimes the people sell because they want to, and sometimes they sell because they're tired of the letters and the phone calls and the men in trucks parked at the end of their road." He looked at her directly. "They want the whole North Ridge. Yours is one of the last pieces they don't have." "Why?" she asked. "Resort development is what they say." He said it flatly, the way you say something you do not believe and have not believed from the beginning. "Golf course, spa, bring in the money from the city. You don't think that's what it is." He reached under the counter and came up with a hand-drawn list of names and parcel numbers, looked at it for a moment with the expression of someone reviewing evidence, then put it back. "I think there's things buried under this valley that certain people would pay a very great deal to keep buried," he said. "And I think Dorothy Callaway knew what some of those things were and spent 15 years deciding what to do about it." He gave her a bottle of water and a paper bag with the sandwich in it, and refused to let her pay for either. She thanked him and picked up her bags and went back out into the bright, cold morning. The walk took 2.5 hours. The pavement ended at a rusted gate she had to climb over, and after that it was the fire road. 2 deep ruts worn into the mountain slope with pine needles thick on the ground between them. The kind of road that exists because people have needed to use it repeatedly over many years, and not for any more official reason than that. The trees closed over almost immediately. The light came through in columns, moving slowly as the wind moved the upper branches, and the sound of the highway was gone, replaced by the sound of the forest, which was large and self-contained and entirely indifferent to her presence. She climbed. The grade was steady and the going was slow with the two bags, and after the first hour, she shifted the smaller bag to her front and the larger to her back, and that arrangement was better. Her legs found their rhythm. She had always been strong without trying to be. The physical competence that comes from years of institutional living, where there is never quite enough of anything, and you learn early to carry what you have and keep moving without expecting anyone to notice. She thought about Dorothy as she walked. She tried to construct a version of her grandmother from the available materials. A woman who had lived alone on a mountain for 15 years. A woman who paid cash and kept to herself and had ways of knowing things about the valley. A woman who had written Leona's name in careful cursive on an envelope and arranged for a brass key with unusual teeth to be delivered to her on the exact right morning. What kind of woman does something like that? The kind who has a reason, Leona thought. The kind who is waiting for something specific and has planned for the wait to be long. She found the property marker on a rusted iron stake half buried in the pine duff, and after that, she left the fire road and followed the boundary line east through scrub and rock until the trees opened slightly and she saw it. The structure was small, maybe 20 feet by 20, with a low porch and a roofline that had given up pretending to be level and windows boarded over with plywood that had been weathering for long enough that the weathering had become permanent. The porch steps had rotted through on one side. The walls were rough-cut pine planks, gray with age, many of them checked and splitting along the grain. A river rock chimney rose from the back corner. One section of the roof had buckled under the weight of some long-past snowfall and been patched with corrugated metal that had itself long since rusted through. It looked abandoned. It looked as though abandonment had become its natural state, as permanent as the rock and the trees around it. She stood in front of it for a moment. The wind moved through the pines with a low sound that was almost like breathing, a regular rise and fall that made the place feel inhabited by something she could not see. She took the brass key from her jacket pocket, climbed the broken porch steps carefully, and tried the lock. The lock was old, the same vintage as the key, and for a moment she thought the mechanism had seized completely, and this was the end of whatever this was. Then she felt the key catch on something deep inside the lock. She applied steady pressure, not forcing it, letting the mechanism remember what it was for. And after 3 long seconds, the lock turned with a sound like something releasing a breath it had been holding for years. The door swung inward on its hinges. The smell that came out was old air and dust and something else underneath both of those. Something faintly sweet she could not name. She stepped inside. It was a single room. The boarded windows let in thin lines of light that lay in pale bars across the floor. In the dim, she could see the outline of a wooden bed frame against the far wall, the mattress reduced to almost nothing by time and moisture and whatever small creatures had used it over the years. A table with one chair, a set of shelves on the wall to her left empty. In the corner, a cast-iron wood stove with a set of iron tools in a stand beside it, a poker, a short shovel, and a long-handled pry bar. That was all. She stood in the center of the room and turned slowly. The floor was thick with dust except near the door where her own footsteps had already disturbed it. The walls were plain wood, unfinished, the grain visible beneath years of grime. The ceiling was low enough that she could almost touch it with her hand raised. She set her bags down. She sat on the edge of the bed frame. The springs that remained groaned under her weight with the sound of something that had been patient for a long time and was not entirely happy about being disturbed. The feeling that settled over her was not despair exactly. She had enough experience with genuine disappointment to know the difference. This was quieter than despair. It was the specific flatness of a thing that had seemed like it might mean something and had turned out to mean nothing after all. $18,000, she thought. Ms. Wren was right. She should sell it and go. She sat for a while in the thin light, letting the feeling be what it was, Then she noticed the dust. It was the distribution of it. Everywhere in the room, the dust lay uniformly thick and undisturbed, except under the table. Under the table, the pattern was different, disturbed in a way that was not random, not the work of animals or weather. A straight line, then an arc, the geometry of something deliberate, as if a door had been opened. She got up and crossed to the table and crouched down and looked at the floor and the pale bars of light. The planks were rough-cut pine like the walls, dark with age and grime. But one section, approximately 2 feet by 3 feet, had a seam around it that the others did not. A seam too regular and too complete to be the natural variation of old wood settling against old wood. She pressed on the center of it. Nothing moved. She pressed on the edge nearest to her. The far side lifted slightly. She hooked her fingers into the gap and pulled. It was not a floorboard. It was a lid, hinged on the far side, lifting to reveal a shallow space below, maybe 8 inches deep, lined with oilcloth that had stiffened with age but had held. In the space were 2 things. The first was a book, bound in dark leather, the cover completely unmarked. She picked it up. It was heavy, dense, with pages filled close. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was Dorothy's, the same careful cursive she recognized from the envelope in the photograph. It was not a journal. It was a log. Dates and measurements and technical notations arranged in columns. She read a few lines. Geological survey complete. Northern quadrant. Clay content nominal. Reinforced concrete poor. Section 3. Curing rate adequate. Ventilation shaft 2. Secondary intake. Fitted and sealed. Construction notes. Precise and methodical. Written by someone who knew what they were building and intended to document every stage of it. The second thing into the compartment was a roll of paper tied with a faded ribbon. She lifted it out with care and undid the ribbon and unrolled the paper on the dusty floor, weighting the corners with the legs of the table. They were architectural drawings, detailed, professional, hand-drafted on proper drafting paper. Multiple sheets layered together. She spread them out one by one. They were not drawings of the shack. They depicted something vast and complex and entirely underground. Multiple levels connected by a central shaft. A main living space on the upper level, with a kitchen area, a sitting room, a library wall. Sleeping quarters for 2 people of different sizes. Below that, a second level with a larger room labeled archive, surrounded by storage rooms on all sides. Below that, mechanical systems drawn in precise detail. Water purification, power generation, ventilation with filtered intake and exhaust, battery banks, communications equipment. At the top of the first page, in block letters that had been drawn with a straight edge, Project Wren. And at the bottom of the page, a site key, a small aerial diagram of the property with a circle marking the location of the shack, and a second marking 200 yards to the north, near a cluster of symbols indicating granite outcropping. Beside the second marking, in Dorothy's hand, entrance, pry open. Leona stayed on her knees on the dusty floor for a long time. She was aware of the cold and the dust and the changed quality of the silence around her, which had shifted from empty to dense, from absence to presence. She was aware of the weight of the drawing paper in her hands, the precision of the lines, the scale notations, the years of work and planning encoded in every carefully drawn detail. She thought about what Corwin had said. Things on that land that'll tell you more than I can. She rolled the drawings carefully back up and tied the ribbon. She tucked the leather log under her arm. She took the long iron pry bar from the stand beside the stove. She went outside and headed north. The granite cluster was where the map indicated it would be. 3 large boulders pushed up from the slope in some ancient geological argument that had been settled long before any human had walked here to observe the outcome. Their surfaces furred with moss and lichen in the slow, patient work of centuries of weather. She walked the perimeter of them twice looking for anything that did not belong to natural stone and earth. She found it on the third pass, low to the ground on the downhill side of the largest boulder, so thoroughly concealed that she had to get on her hands and knees to see it clearly in the dappled light. A circle of iron, rusted to nearly the exact color of the surrounding earth, set flush against what appeared to be solid ground, but was, on closer examination, a metal plate covered in decades of accumulated soil and pine duff and the patient disguise of years. She scraped at the edge with the end of the pry bar, and iron revealed itself beneath. A hatch, circular, approximately 4 feet across, sunk level with the ground and seamlessly covered. She dug for an hour. Her hands were raw and bleeding by the time she had the circumference clear enough to work with. There was a recessed handle, a half circle of iron welded to the center of the hatch, and she got the flat end of the pry bar under it and wedged a rock beneath the bar for leverage and put her full weight on the far end. Nothing happened for a long moment. The resistance was total and absolute. Then, with a deep internal groan that she felt through the soles of her feet as much as she heard it, something gave. Not the hatch itself, but something beneath it. A seal. A sound like compressed air releasing from a contained space. And then the hatch moved, grinding against its rim, counterweighted from below, rising once the seal had broken with increasing ease until it stood vertical, open to the afternoon sky, revealing a circular shaft going straight down into the dark. Steel rungs bolted into smooth concrete, cold air rising from below, dry and mineral, the smell of a sealed space that had been properly maintained. She shone the light from her phone down into the shaft. The rungs descended 30, 40, 50 feet and more. The bottom was too deep to see clearly from above. She stood at the edge of the open hatch for a long time. The sky above her was turning the pale gold of late afternoon. The wind moved through the pines. Far below in the valley, she could see the roof of Corwin's store, and beyond it, the ribbon of the county highway, and beyond that, the mountains going blue in the fading light. She thought about the $18,000. Then she thought about Dorothy writing her name in careful cursive. Then she stopped thinking and swung her legs over the edge, found the first rung with her boot, and began to climb down. The descent took longer than she expected. The air grew colder and stiller, and the smells of the surface world faded behind her, replaced by something clean and deep and absolutely quiet. The air of a place that had been sealed and preserved and was now, for the first time in a long time, being opened. She counted the rungs. 53. At 53, her feet touched a solid concrete floor. She was in a small circular room, smooth concrete walls, gray and unmarked. Directly in front of her, a heavy steel door with a wheel mechanism at the center, spoked iron fitted to a central locking bar of the kind used on ship bulkheads or bank vaults, built to hold against significant pressure from either direction. She put both hands on the wheel and turned. It was stiff at first, stiff the way things get when they have not moved in years, but have been properly maintained against the day they would need to move again. Then it was not stiff. The bolts drew back in sequence, 4 of them, each one making a sound she could feel through her palms as much as hear with her ears. The door swung inward. The air that came through was cool and clean, and carried no smell of decay or mold or the damp that destroys things over time. It was the air of a sealed space that had been built by someone who understood what they were building and had done it correctly. She stepped through the doorway and raised her phone. The light swept the room. She stood still for a long time. It was a home. A large open space, 15 feet high at the center, furnished with chairs and a sofa and a low table, all covered in white dust cloths that had gathered dust but had not degraded, had not collapsed or rotted, had simply waited. Bookshelves ran the full length of one wall, packed tight with books, their spines visible in her light, hundreds of them, a lifetime of reading. A kitchen area occupied one corner, the countertops clean beneath their layer of dust. The appliances, the simple and reliable kind, built to function for decades without drama. A lamp sat on a side table near the sofa, its shade still perfectly straight. It was not a survival shelter. It was not a bunker in any military or emergency sense of that word. It was a place where someone had intended to live, had designed and built and furnished with the intention of actually living in it, where someone had intended for 2 people to live. She walked the room slowly, her footsteps making almost no sound on the concrete floor. She touched the back of one of the chairs, and her fingertip left a clean trace in the dust. She tilted a book out from the shelf. It was a novel she had read in the group home in Modesto, a paperback with its cover bent from many readings. The kind of book that ends up in group homes because someone kept reading it until it fell apart and then passed it on. She put it back. There were 3 doors off the main room. She opened the first, a bedroom, a neatly made bed with the blankets tucked smooth under decades of settled dust. A small wooden desk, a closet with its door slightly open showing neatly hung clothes preserved by the sealed air. On the desk, a framed photograph. She picked it up. 3 people. An older woman, younger than the photograph Leona had carried in her bag, but unmistakably Dorothy. The same strong hands, the same smile. A man in his 30s with dark hair and an open, serious face. The face of someone who thinks carefully before speaking. A woman beside him, laughing, her head tilted back, one hand raised in the middle of some gesture, caught there permanently by the camera. And in the woman's other arm, held against her hip, a baby small enough to be new to the world. The laughing woman's smile, the particular shape of it, the way it reached all the way to her eyes and changed the whole geometry of her face. Leona had seen that smile before, in mirrors. She sat down on the edge of the bed. Her hands were still raw from the digging, and the metal of the bed frame was cold, but she did not notice either of those things. She held the photograph in the beam of her phone light and looked at the 4 people in it for a very long time. At the bottom right corner of the frame, a strip of paper had been taped with the care of someone making a permanent label. Written in Dorothy's hand, Claire Everett and our Leona, the reason for everything. The second door opened into a smaller room, a narrow bed, child-sized, a chest of drawers, a shelf of children's books with their spines faded but their titles still legible, a small wooden box on the dresser with a simple latch. She opened it. Inside was a child's drawing, crayon on folded paper, a house and a tree, and 2 stick figures of different heights, the taller one holding the hand of the smaller one. Written at the top in the careful large letters of a child who has recently learned to write, "Me and Grandma Dorothy." She had no memory of drawing it, but the handwriting was hers. She recognized the particular way she had always formed her capital M, with a slight lean to the right that no one had ever managed to correct. Somewhere in a past that existed before her memory began, she had been here. Dorothy had known her when she was small enough to draw stick figures with crayons and write 4 words across the top of a folded piece of paper. She closed the box and set it back exactly where it had been. The name was above the bed, carved into the wood of the headboard with the deliberate care of someone who intended it to be permanent. Block letters, clean-edged, filled with what had once been white paint and had faded to near invisible against the wood. Leona. She stood in the doorway of that room for a long time without moving. Then her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. She looked at the screen. An unknown number, a Sacramento area code. She answered. The voice was smooth and measured, the voice of a man who was accustomed to having his calls returned promptly and who understood how to use silence and pace to create the impression of control. "Ms. Marsh," he said, "my name is Chester Vane. I represent the legal interests of Vidian Terra Corporation. I understand you've recently come into possession of the Callaway parcel in Shale Pass. I wanted to reach out personally to discuss our standing offer." He paused briefly in the way of a man who has learned that pauses create the impression of generosity without requiring anything. "Given your circumstances," he continued, "we'd like to improve our original offer considerably. We're prepared to offer $60,000 for the parcel. Cash settlement, close in 2 weeks. It's a very clean transaction, and frankly, it's more than the land warrants by any reasonable market assessment." $60,000. She was standing 50 feet underground in a room her grandmother had built for the 2 of them, holding a photograph of parents she had never known, with their daughter's name carved into the headboard of the bed they had intended for her. She looked at the photograph. The reason for everything. "It's not for sale," she said. The silence on the other end shifted quality, a different kind of silence than the deliberate pause before. "Ms. Marsh," he said, and his voice had changed almost imperceptibly, the warmth still technically present in the words, but with something underneath it now that was not warmth at all. I'd encourage you to think carefully. That is a very remote piece of land. The winters up there can be unpredictable. Accidents happen on mountain roads and in rough terrain. It would be a real shame for things to become complicated for someone just starting out in the world. He left it there. The implication needed no completion. Leona looked at the photograph of her mother, caught in the middle of laughing, stopped there permanently. A woman who had been 31 years old and had not come home from a mountain road. She lowered her phone and ended the call. Outside, through 50 feet of granite and concrete and pine-needled earth, the sun was going down over the valley. She could not see it from here. She could not hear the wind in the pines or the sound of Corwin's door or the last light moving across the high peaks. But she did not need to see any of it to know exactly where she was. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had been supposed to be here for 18 years. She had simply not known it until now. The third door was heavier than the first two. It was set into the far wall of the main living space, past the kitchen and past the bookshelves. And it was different from the other doors, the way a door to a vault is different from a door to a bedroom. The frame was reinforced steel, painted to match the concrete, and the door itself was solid core with a keypad lock mounted at eye level. But the door was not fully closed. It stood a quarter-inch ajar, the way a door stands when someone meant to pull it shut and did not quite manage it, or when someone wanted to ensure that whoever came next would not mistake it for a wall. Leona pushed it open with her fingertips. The room beyond was larger than she had expected. 20 feet square, perhaps, with shelving units running floor to ceiling on 3 walls, each unit filled with banker's boxes labeled in Dorothy's hand. The labels were methodical. Dates, file numbers, subject codes she would need time to learn to read. In the far corner, 2 computer terminals from the late 90s sat on a long work table, their screens dark and covered with the same fine dust that lay over everything. Beside them, a cassette player of the kind made for transcription work, small and rectangular and built for function. A rack of videotape cases lined the wall above it. And beside the rack, a shallow cardboard box holding perhaps 30 cassette tapes in individual labeled cases. On the central table, one banker's box had been pulled forward from the shelves and left open. Inside it, she could see the tops of file folders, the edges of documents, the corner of what appeared to be a videotape in a clear case. And on top of everything, placed with the deliberateness of something meant to be found first, a thick envelope, her name on the front, the same cursive. The ink slightly faded, as if it had been written some years ago and had been waiting patiently ever since. She sat down in the chair at the work table. The chair was old office surplus, the kind with a foam seat that had compressed to nothing decades ago, and it creaked under her weight with the sound of something that had been waiting to be sat in for a long time. She picked up the envelope. Inside were 12 pages of paper folded in thirds, covered front and back in Dorothy's handwriting. The pages were dated. The first page carried a date from 7 years ago. The last page carried a date from 4 months before Dorothy died, written in the same careful hand, but with a slight unevenness in the pressure that had not been there in the earlier pages. Beneath the pages, in a small paper sleeve, a cassette tape. On the label, in Dorothy's hand, "For Leona. Play first." She looked at the transcription player on the table. She pressed the eject button. The door opened. She inserted the tape and pressed it shut and found the play button. There was a moment of hiss, the sound of blank tape running, and then a voice filled the room. It was not the voice she had imagined. She had imagined something fragile, the voice of an old woman at the end of her strength. What she heard was steady and deliberate, with a slight roughness in the lower register that came from years of cold mountain air and outdoor living and never minding either. The accent was Pacific Northwest by way of somewhere older and quieter, the flat, careful diction of a person who grew up in a place where words were not wasted and silence was not considered a problem. "My name is Dorothy Eleanor Calloway," the voice said. "I am recording this in the spring, and I do not expect to see another one. I am leaving this tape for my granddaughter, Leona Margaret Marsh, who will be 18 years old when she hears it, if I have arranged things correctly. I have arranged things correctly. I have had 15 years to arrange them, and I am not a careless woman. A pause. The hiss of the tape continuing beneath the silence. I am going to tell you the truth now, the voice said. All of it. I owe you that much, and I owe you a great deal more than that. But the truth is what I have to give, and I am going to give it to you plainly because you are my granddaughter, and I believe you are strong enough to hold it. You come from people who were strong enough to hold hard truths. I believe it traveled. Leona spread the pages of the letter on the table in front of her. She followed along as the voice spoke, the written words and the spoken words moving together, the tape slightly ahead of the pages in some places and slightly behind in others, as if Dorothy had read from an earlier draft when she recorded it and had revised the written version afterward. Your mother's name was Claire Ann Calloway Marsh, the voice said. She was 31 years old when she died. She was a journalist, not the kind that covers ribbon cuttings and city council votes, the kind who spends 2 years on a single story because she knows it matters and she is going to get it exactly right no matter what it takes and no matter how long. Your father's name was Everett James Marsh. He was a research scientist, environmental chemistry. He worked for a university consortium that did independent water quality testing, which means he was not employed by industry and could not be leaned on by industry, which is precisely why your mother chose him when she needed someone whose data could not be questioned or purchased or made to go away. They met at a conference. Your mother was covering a story about agricultural runoff in the Central Valley. Your father was presenting research. She told me later that she knew within the first 10 minutes that he was the most rigorous person she had ever met in her life, and that she found this quality entirely irresistible. They were married 14 months later. You were born the year after that. The voice paused. When it resumed, something in it had tightened. When you were 2 years old, your father found something in the water. He was conducting independent sampling in 4 counties across 3 states, standard monitoring work, the kind of work that generates data no one in authority reads unless something forces him to. But what he found in the water table in certain rural areas did not match any natural geological signature. It was industrial. Specific chemical compounds that could only come from the improper disposal of manufacturing waste, and the concentrations were not trace amounts. They were high enough to explain certain patterns in the public health data for those same areas. Elevated cancer rates, neurological disorders in children, health outcomes that the county health departments had been recording faithfully for a decade and attributing to everything except the actual cause. He traced the disposal sites. It took him 18 months of careful, unrewarded work. Then he traced the company responsible for the disposal. It was Vidian Terra. At the time, Vidian Terra was not primarily a real estate development company. It was the land acquisition and disposal subsidiary of a larger chemical manufacturing conglomerate. The resort development came later as a rebranding. What they were doing in those years was acquiring remote rural parcels cheaply, land with no utilities and no road access and no neighbors who could afford lawyers, and using those parcels as unlicensed disposal sites for chemical waste that would have cost them tens of millions of dollars to handle legally and properly. They had been doing it for more than 20 years. Your father had proof, soil core samples, water table analyses, chain of custody documentation for the waste itself, internal shipping manifests he obtained through a source inside the company. He had mapped 11 active disposal sites across 4 states. He had connected each site to specific health outcomes in the surrounding communities. The documentation was, in his own words when he described it to me, airtight. Your mother was writing the story. Leona looked up from the pages. The tape continued without pause. They knew it was dangerous work, Dorothy's voice said. They were not naive people. They took precautions. They made copies of all the primary source material and distributed those copies to people they trusted. One set came to me. I did not know at the time the full extent of what it contained. I knew it was important, and I knew I was to keep it safe and tell no one under any circumstances. In the fall of the year you turned 3, your parents drove north to meet with their source a final time. The source had additional internal documents that had not yet been transferred. They were coming back the same night. They did not come back. The Highway Patrol report described a logging truck that lost its brakes on a mountain grade. A head-on collision at a curve with no guardrail. Both vehicles destroyed. Your parents were killed instantly. The truck driver survived with minor injuries and disappeared from the area within 1 week of the accident. The investigation was closed in 30 days. I knew it was not an accident. I knew because 3 days before they drove north, your mother called me. She told me they had been followed, that there had been an approach, a man who met your father at a gas station and made very clear, without saying anything that could be recorded or repeated in a legal proceeding, that the story should not be published and would not benefit anyone for it to be published. Your father had reported this to the university. The university's legal counsel had advised him to suspend the research pending review. Your mother was furious. She told me they were going anyway. She told me that if anything happened, I was to take you and the evidence and disappear completely. I took the evidence. I put you in the car, and I drove for 3 days, and I did not stop except for gas. But I could not keep you with me. I want you to understand why. I am asking you to understand something that I am not certain can be understood, only accepted. And I am asking for your forgiveness alongside the understanding. Vidi and Tara had resources and reach, and they had already demonstrated in the clearest possible terms what they were willing to do to protect what they had built. If I kept you with me, you were a target. You were the daughter of the people who held the evidence, and you were 3 years old, and I was a 61-year-old woman alone on a mountain with no protection and no plan beyond hiding. I could not protect you and protect the evidence and protect myself all at the same time. It was not possible. But if you were no one, if you were a ward of the state, a name in a file cabinet, moved from one facility to another on a schedule I could not predict and they could not follow, then you were invisible to them. They were not looking for an orphan. They were looking for Dorothy Calloway's granddaughter. So I made you an orphan. I drove you to the county facility in Fresno on a Tuesday morning in October. I signed the forms. I kissed your forehead. You were wearing a yellow jacket with small wooden buttons, and you smelled like the soap we had used at the motel the night before. You did not cry when I left. You watched me go with your mother's eyes, wide open and steady, and you did not cry. And I have not stopped thinking about that moment for 15 years. It was the bravest thing I ever saw. And you were 3 years old, and you did not even know you were being brave. The tape hissed. Dorothy's voice returned quieter. Every year on your birthday, I drove to Fresno. I parked on the street outside the facility, and I stayed for an hour, just to know you were still there, just to count one more year of you being safe in the world. I am sorry, Leona. I am sorry for every year. I am sorry for every birthday I watched from a car window on a public street instead of across a table in a room where you could see me. I am sorry for every time you needed someone and there was no one. I built this place for us. I built it so that when the time was right, we could live here together, hidden and safe, while we worked out what to do with what your parents had left. But the time was never quite right. And I was never quite brave enough to risk bringing you into this before you were old enough to choose it for yourself. The evidence is in this room, all of it. Your father's data and your mother's reporting, in the source documentation, in the recorded testimony of the man who gave them the inside information. A chemical engineer named Frank Sully, who worked inside Vidian for 11 years and knew in precise technical detail where the bodies were buried, in every sense of that phrase. Frank disappeared in 2007. I believe he is still alive. I believe he went to ground for exactly the same reason I did. In the bottom drawer of this table, there is a lockbox. The combination is your birthday, month and day and year. Inside is money, what remained of your parents' savings after I used the rest to build this place. It is enough to go anywhere in the world and start over and never look back at any of this. That is one choice. The other choice is this room. Whatever you decide, know this without any doubt. I never abandoned you. Every day of every year I knew where you were and I loved you without stopping. Not for a single day. This land, this place, this archive. It is the last thing I had to give you. It is everything I had. Be careful, my Leona, and be brave. You come from people who were both. The tape clicked to its end and the player stopped. When the tape clicked off, the room came back. The same concrete walls and dusty shelves and rows of boxes, but nothing in it felt the same as it had 3 hours ago. Leona sat very still and let the quiet settle around her like something with physical weight, pressing in from all sides, and she let it press. She was not aware of crying until she felt the coldness on her face, where the tears had already dried. She had not cried since she was 7 years old, the night she was moved from the second foster placement to the group home, and had understood finally and completely that the situation she was in was not a temporary mistake that would be corrected, was not a misunderstanding that someone was working to fix, but was simply her life and she was going to have to live it. She had cried that night and then stopped and had not started again in 11 years. She started again now, in a room underground, surrounded by the careful work of a woman she barely remembered, and she let it happen completely. She cried for her mother who had been 31 years old and laughing and had not come home from a mountain road. For her father who had found something true in the water and had followed it to the end regardless of the cost. For Dorothy who had spent 15 years alone on a mountain choosing, every single day, to protect her over being with her, carrying that choice without complaint and without anyone to tell it to. When it was finished, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and sat in the quiet for a few more minutes. Then she opened the bottom drawer of the work table. The lockbox was there, black metal, small enough to lift with one hand. She turned the dial. Month, day, year. The lid opened. Inside, vacuum sealed in clear plastic, stacked in neat bundles. Cash. More cash than she had ever seen gathered in one place. She did not count it then. Later, she would count it and find it totaled $114,000. She looked at it for a moment. Then she closed the lid and pushed the drawer shut. She spread the pages of Dorothy's letter in front of her and read them all the way through once more from the beginning. Then she began to work. She did not call anyone. She did not know yet who could be trusted, and the question of who could be trusted was not one to answer carelessly. Vidian Terra was a company that had murdered 2 people and buried the investigation in a county report and walked away without consequence, which meant they had access at levels she could not yet see and influence in places she could not yet map. She would not make contact with anyone until she understood fully what she had. She would understand what she had first. She started with the open box on the table, the one Dorothy had staged for her. Inside, she found 3 distinct categories of material. The first was her father's research: scientific reports, data tables, chain of custody logs for the water and soil samples, lab analyses from the University Consortium's testing facility, certified and dated, supplementary materials including maps of the 4-state sampling area, with each disposal site marked and cross-referenced to geological surveys, showing how the contamination had moved and would continue to move through the water table over time. She read the reports slowly and carefully. She had taken chemistry in high school, better than average, and she had the kind of mind that could move through technical material without losing the logical thread that ran through it. Her father's writing was precise and unadorned. He stated what he had found, how he had found it, and what it meant. He did not editorialize or draw conclusions beyond what the data supported. He did not need to. The numbers said everything that needed to be said. She copied the disposal site coordinates by hand onto the back of a blank page from Dorothy's letter. She drew a rough map from memory of the 4-state region and marked each site. Then she opened the box of her mother's reporting materials. Claire Marsh had been a different kind of writer entirely. Wherever it was precise and restrained, Claire was relentless. Her notes filled margins and ran off the edges of pages and continued on the backs and sometimes on separate pages tucked into the folders. Interview transcripts, typed but with handwritten corrections and additions that sometimes overwhelmed the typed text. A timeline of Vivian's land acquisitions going back 23 years. Cross-reference with public health records from the surrounding counties. Lists of names, company executives, local officials, politicians whose campaign finance records showed contributions from Vivian subsidiaries, a web of connection and influence that her mother had been building patiently for 2 years and had been 3 weeks from publishing. She read for 6 hours without stopping. She did not eat. She did not notice being hungry. The cassette player sat at the edge of the table, and occasionally she would reach over and press play on one of the interview tapes from the cardboard box, listening to her mother's voice conducting interviews, pressing sources with questions that were patient and precise and absolutely unyielding, pushing back on evasions with a calm that never wavered. She listened to her mother's voice and understood exactly why Dorothy had said she was the best journalist. She was. At some point in the deep middle of the night, the quality of the silence changed in a way she became aware of gradually. The way you become aware of a smell, not as a single moment of recognition, but as an accumulation until it is all you can notice. The silence was the same as it had been. Her relationship to it had changed. She was no longer sitting in an underground room surrounded by someone else's work and someone else's history. She was sitting in her inheritance. She got up and made coffee in the kitchen, which had been stocked with sealed provisions that had kept for years in the controlled environment. Instant coffee, the kind that survives decades in sealed packaging. She brought the mug back to the table and kept reading. The videotape was at the bottom of the box. The case was clear plastic with a typed label. F. Sully, primary testimony, recorded November. It was dated 8 months before her parents died. She crossed the room and pressed the power button on the VHS player in the wall unit. A red standby light came on. She fed the tape into the slot. It caught and drew in with the sound of old machinery doing what it was built to do. The screen on the monitor came to life with static, then stabilized. A plain room, a table and 2 chairs and a single lamp providing all the light. Camera on a tripod, no camera person. In one chair sat a woman she recognized immediately. Her mother, Claire, younger than in the photograph but unmistakably herself. Her hair pulled back, a legal pad on the table. Her posture, the posture of someone who has done this many times and knows how to make a frightened person feel safe enough to talk. In the other chair sat a man. He was in his 50s, heavy set, with the posture of someone who had spent years trying to take up less space than he physically occupied. His face was partially obscured by the angle of the lamp, and Leona understood immediately that this was deliberate and agreed upon in advance. He had come to talk, but had come on the condition that his face would not be clearly visible. He identified himself as Frank Sully, chemical process engineer, 11 years with the waste management division of the company that would later reorganize and rebrand as Vivian Terra Corporation. He spoke for 2 hours and 18 minutes. Leona watched every minute of it. He described in precise technical language what the company had been doing for 2 decades before he joined, and continued to do throughout his tenure. The acquisition strategy for remote rural parcels, the transportation logistics using unmarked contracted vehicles, the excavation of disposal pits, the chemical stabilization process, the burial and concealment, the monitoring of the sites to ensure containment. He described it the way a person describes a process they perform repeatedly over many years and know in the kind of detail that comes only from direct hands-on involvement. He described the internal documentation system, the falsified safety reports filed with state environmental agencies, reports that described legal disposal at certified facilities while the actual waste went to the concealed rural sites. The internal coding system used to track the illegal locations, a system he had been personally responsible for maintaining for 3 years. He described the health outcomes in the surrounding communities that the company had been tracking internally and had chosen to manage through influence rather than remediation. Strategic donations to county health departments, retainer agreements with local law firms, occasional quiet cash settlements with families who made noise, always accompanied by non-disclosure clauses. And at the end of the tape, his voice dropping until it was barely audible, he described a conversation he had been present for, a meeting in an executive conference room where the name Marsh had come up, where he had understood from what was said and what was carefully not said that the people who held information about Vidian's operations had become a problem and that the problem was going to be resolved. He had gone into that meeting not knowing what kind of meeting it was. He had left it knowing he was not safe. He had given Claire everything he had, and then he had disappeared. His plan was to wait until the story was published and then surface to give full testimony in whatever legal proceedings followed. He had trusted her completely. The tape ended. Leona sat in the dark room for a long time after the monitor returned to static. Then she got up and began going through the filing cabinets. She worked through the rest of that night and into the following morning. She pulled boxes and went through them in sequence, building the complete picture from its component parts. The scientific data established the contamination and its source. Her mother's reporting established the corporate structure and the chain of decision-making. Frank Sully's testimony established the internal documentation and the deliberate concealment at every level. The chain of custody records established that none of the primary material had been altered or compromised in the 15 years it had been stored here. It had been waiting here for someone to pick it up and carry it forward. She began to organize. She created a logical sequence for the material, an order in which it would need to be presented for maximum evidentiary value and legal durability. She pulled the documents that were most critical and irreplaceable and separated them from the supporting material. She labeled everything she touched in her own hand, adding her labels to Dorothy's, creating a second layer of documentation that established her own chain of custody from this point forward. She found a portable scanner in a cabinet below the work table, old but functional, and she used it to create digital copies of the primary documents, saving the files to a thumb drive from a bag of blank drives she found in the same cabinet. Dorothy had thought of everything, including the possibility that whoever came after her would need to duplicate the archive quickly. She made 2 copies of the thumb drive. She was sitting at the table going through the last box of her mother's files when she noticed the unlabeled box. It was at the back of the lowest shelf, pushed behind 2 other boxes, cardboard that was slightly less yellowed than everything around it, suggesting it had been placed there later than the rest of the archive. She pulled it out and opened it. Inside, a single manila folder, and inside the folder, a document approximately 30 pages long, printed on heavyweight paper with a cover page bearing a corporate seal she recognized. Vidian Terra, LLC. Below the seal, Shale Pass Valley Acquisition and Development Agreement. Below that, the parties, Vidian Terra, LLC, and the Office of the Siskiyou County Board of Supervisors. Signed, dated, notarized, 2019. She read the document from the first page to the last without stopping. It was not a resort development agreement in any meaningful sense. The resort was present in the document, yes, described in 3 pages of architectural summary and projected economic impact numbers. But it was the frame, the presentation layer, the thing you showed county supervisors and local newspapers and chambers of commerce. What the body of the document actually established was a comprehensive land use agreement that included provisions for what was described in a technical appendix as remediation staging, defined using language she now recognized precisely from her father's research. Remediation staging. The storage and processing of legacy industrial materials in designated subsurface containment areas. They were not coming to Shale Pass to build a resort. They were coming to Shale Pass to bury more waste. The resort was the cover. The real plan was in the technical appendix. In her land, the 72 acres that Dorothy had bought and held and paid taxes on for 15 years was identified in the appendix by parcel number as one of the 3 primary staging areas. That was why the offer kept rising. Not because they wanted a golf course, because her land was where they needed to put what they could not afford to let anyone find. She set the document down and sat with that for a moment. They had offered her $18,000, then $60,000, for a site they needed as the cornerstone of a plan worth hundreds of millions in avoided legal disposal costs, for a piece of land sitting directly above an underground archive containing 15 years of preserved evidence of their crimes. She put the county agreement in the priority box with the other primary documents and added it to the thumb drive copies. Then she heard the sound above her. It came through the concrete and the earth, muffled and distorted by distance but identifiable. The sound of vehicles, multiple engines idling, then going quiet, doors opening and closing. She could not hear voices, but she could feel the vibration of footsteps on the surface above. She looked at her phone. Late afternoon. She had been in the archive for nearly 24 hours. She climbed the ladder carefully, keeping her footsteps quiet on the rungs, and raised the hatch just enough to see out at ground level. Two black trucks were parked at the edge of the property where the fire road met the boundary. Clean trucks, the kind that belong in city parking structures and not on mountain roads, and know it. Four men she did not recognize standing near them. And Chester Vane, in a dark coat, holding a document case, looking at his phone. She watched without moving. After a few minutes, one of the men walked to the porch of the shack and set an envelope on the step and walked back to the truck without looking around. Then both trucks drove back down the fire road. She waited until the engine sounds were completely gone. Then she climbed out, lowered the hatch behind her, and walked to the shack. The envelope bore the letterhead of a law firm in Sacramento. Inside, a document she read standing on the porch in the last of the afternoon light. It purported to be a court order, a temporary injunction issued by the Siskiyou County Superior Court, requiring her to vacate the property within 72 hours pending resolution of a title dispute filed by Vidian Terra Corporation. She folded it and put it in her jacket pocket. She stood on the porch and looked at the pines in the valley below and the road disappearing into the trees. No power, no road access they had not now effectively blocked. No one who knew she was here except Corwin Alderman, and she had no way to reach him without walking 5 miles down a road that Vidian's trucks had just used. She was 18 years old and alone on a mountain with 2 thumb drives and a box of documents and no plan. Then she thought about Dorothy, who had been 61 years old and alone on the same mountain, and had made a plan that had survived 15 years intact. She thought about her mother, 31 years old, who had kept pushing when she had every reason to stop. She thought about the document in her pocket, which she was fairly certain was not a legitimate court order, because legitimate court orders are not hand-delivered by men in clean city trucks to remote mountain properties at 4 in the afternoon. She went back to the shack and climbed down the ladder and sat in the chair at the work table and opened Dorothy's letter to the last page. At the very bottom, below the date and the signature, was a handwritten note she had read past the first time. One name, one phone number, one line. Breckett Holt, attorney at law. Call him only when you are ready to fight. She looked at the name for a long time. Then she looked at the shelves and the boxes and the thumb drives in her hand, and the monitor still showing static from Frank Sully's tape. She dialed the number. 4 rings. Then a voice, rough and alert, the voice of a man who does not sleep deeply and has made his peace with that. Holt, the voice said. Mr. Holt, she said. My name is Leona Marsh. My grandmother was Dorothy Calloway. I'm calling from the archive. The silence that followed was not the silence of a man who did not understand. It was the silence of a man who had been waiting, not expecting, but waiting for a long time to hear exactly those words. Don't move, he said. Don't go above ground until I tell you it's clear. I'll be there by morning. Breckett Holt arrived at first light. She heard his truck on the fire road before she saw it, a single engine coming up at a pace that was neither hurried nor cautious, the pace of a man who had made his decision and was acting on it without drama. She had climbed out of the hatch before dawn and was sitting on the granite boulder above the entrance when he came through the trees on foot from where he had parked below. He was older than his voice had suggested, 70 or very close to it, with the lean and deliberate build of a man who had never stopped moving and had no intention of starting. White hair cut short, a face that had been weathered by decades of something more demanding than ordinary weather. He wore a canvas work coat and carried a leather satchel over one shoulder, and he walked up the slope without stopping to catch his breath. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the hatch. She showed him down. He did not speak for the first hour. He moved through the archive the way she imagined her mother had moved into a new investigation, methodically, touching nothing until he understood the organizational system, then working through it from left to right with his reading glasses on and a notepad open in his hand. He read the documents she had flagged. He watched 15 minutes of Frank Sully's tape standing in front of the monitor with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. He read the county agreement from cover page to the last line of the technical appendix and then read the appendix a second time. Then he sat down across from her at the work table. "Your mother," he said, "was the best journalist I never got to work with." He said it the way you state a fact you have held for a long time. "I knew about the Marsh investigation," he said. "In 2007, when it disappeared, I made inquiries through every channel I had. I was told the evidence had been lost in the accident. I was told there was nothing left to pursue." He looked at the rows of boxes, the shelving units, the cassette rack on the wall. "Your grandmother was the most patient woman in American legal history." He picked up his notepad. "Here's what we have," he said. "Primary scientific data establishing contamination and source, chain of custody intact. Investigative reporting establishing corporate structure and decision-making. Whistleblower testimony naming specific executives and describing specific criminal decisions. And a 2019 county agreement that establishes current criminal intent and implicates elected county officials." He set the notepad down. "Here is what they have. Money, lawyers, 15 years of experience making inconvenient things disappear, and the institutional confidence of people who have done this before and faced no consequences." He looked at her steadily. "That injunction they served you is fraudulent," he said. "I know every judge in Siskiyou County and none of them signed that document. I would have been contacted by the court if a legitimate title dispute had been filed under my client's name." He paused. "They do not yet know what is in this room. If they knew, they would not be serving paper. They would be doing something significantly more serious." "What would they be doing?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her directly. "Something we are not going to give them the opportunity to do," he said. He laid out the strategy, not a plan he had arrived with, but one he built in front of her, out loud, testing each element as he stated it, adjusting when she pointed out problems she had identified in the archive. She pointed out 2 specific issues in the first 20 minutes that changed his assessment of the sequencing. Each time he stopped and reconsidered without resistance and adjusted accordingly. He was not managing her. He was working with her, and the distinction was clear and mutual from the first few minutes. The fraudulent injunction would be handled through his contacts in the county court system. Her legal standing on the property would be formally asserted immediately, and then the EPA. He looked at the county agreement. "This document," he said, "implicates the county in a federal environmental crime. On its face, as written. The moment it reaches a federal agency, the jurisdictional picture changes entirely. Vidian has influence at the county level. They have maintained that influence for years. They do not have the same influence at the federal level, and more importantly, a federal investigation supersedes everything they can manufacture locally." "Who do we take it to?" she asked. He named a specific investigator at the EPA regional office in Sacramento, a woman he had worked with on 2 previous cases. "But," he said, and he looked at her directly, "I am not going to be the one to take it to her." She looked back at him. "The chain of custody on this document runs from Dorothy to you," he said. "You found it. You removed it from this archive. You have held it. If I present it, Vidian's lawyers will challenge the chain at every step and manufacture something to argue about. If you present it, the chain is clean. You are the documented heir to the property. You discovered the document on the property you legally own. You brought it to the attention of the relevant federal authority. There is no argument." He wrote the investigator's name on a card and slid it across the table. "I will call her tonight," he said. "You go tomorrow. I will be filing our counter-response to the fraudulent injunction while you are in Sacramento. We move simultaneously on both fronts. Vivian will not know which direction to look first. She picked up the card and read it. What if they follow me, she asked. He allowed himself something that was close to a smile, but not quite there. Then they are 40 miles away from this archive while you are walking in the front door of a federal building, he said. Either way, we benefit from the situation. She left before dawn. She drove Brackett's truck, an old Chevrolet that started without drama and attracted no attention, down the fire road and onto the county highway and south toward Sacramento. The sky went from dark blue to gray to the hard, clear gold of early morning, and the mountains shrank in the rearview mirror as she descended until they were a clean line on the horizon, and then nothing. She had the county agreement in a sealed envelope on the seat beside her. She had her deed and her identification and Brackett's card and the thumb drives and nothing else. She thought about her father as she drove, about 18 months of independent sampling work that no one in authority was paying attention to, following a chemical signature through water tables across state lines, doing the kind of careful, unrewarded work that is only possible if you believe the work matters more than whether anyone notices you doing it. About the gas station conversation with the man who made himself clear without saying anything recordable, and her father going anyway. She thought about Dorothy sitting in a parked car on a street in Fresno once a year for 15 years. She drove for 4 hours. She parked in a structure 2 blocks from the federal building on Capitol Mall at 8:45 in the morning. She sat in the truck with the envelope on the seat beside her and thought about her father walking into the gas station knowing someone was watching him and going to the meeting anyway. Then she picked up the envelope and got out of the truck. The EPA regional office was on the 4th floor. The receptionist took her name and made a call, and within 10 minutes, a woman came through the security door. She was in her 50s, compact, with the settled and brisk manner of someone who had spent decades working in a bureaucratic institution without being shaped by it in the way bureaucracies try to shape people. She looked at Leona. She looked at the envelope. "Mr. Holt called me last night," she said. "Come in." They sat in a conference room for 2 hours. Leona laid out the material in the sequence she had established in the archive. Her father's scientific data first, then her mother's documentation of the corporate structure, then the county agreement with the technical appendix. She spoke clearly and without editorializing, stating what each document was, how it had come to be in the archive, and what it demonstrated. She spoke the way her father had written his reports. The investigator did not interrupt. She took precise notes. She asked 3 questions, each directed at a specific evidentiary detail. Leona answered all 3 without hesitation. At the end, the investigator sat back and looked at the documents arranged between them. "The county agreement is a federal crime," she said, "on its face as written." She tapped the technical appendix. "This language describes unpermitted subsurface disposal of regulated industrial waste. It is not ambiguous language, and it does not require interpretation." She looked up. "What you have brought into this room today is not a complaint. It is a case. A fully developed federal case with primary source documentation, a whistleblower on record, and a current agreement establishing ongoing criminal intent." Leona said she understood. "Do not discuss this with anyone outside of Mr. Holt," the investigator said. "Do not respond to any contact from Vivian or their representatives." She held Leona's gaze. "These are people who have done this before." "I know," Leona said. She drove back north. The mountains grew back into the windshield as she climbed, growing from a distant line into something solid and known. And by the time she turned off the county highway onto the fire road, the trees had closed in on both sides, and the air through the cracked window carried pine and cold rock, and the smell of the specific place she was returning to. And she felt the particular relief of a person arriving at the only place that had ever been arranged specifically for her. Brackett was in the archive when she climbed down, on the phone. He held up one finger, finished his call, and looked at her. "The injunction has been flagged with the court administrator," he said. "2 of the 3 signatures on it are forgeries. The 3rd is a legitimate notary stamp used without authorization." He paused. "Vivian is going to know by end of day that the injunction will not hold." She told him about the meeting in Sacramento. He listened without expression. Then he said, "They are going to move quickly now." He was right. 2 days later, Chester Vane called her directly. She was on the porch of the shack, replacing the rotted decking boards, methodical physical work she had been doing in the hours between time in the archive. She answered. His voice had recalibrated completely. Not warm, not cold. Careful. The voice of a man adjusting his approach based on updated information. He proposed a meeting in Sacramento, in person, at his firm's offices. He named a figure. $2 million, he said. Clear title transfer, full settlement, no further obligations on either side. When, she asked. He named a date 2 days out. She said she would think about it. She told Beckett that evening. He listened, then asked what she wanted to do. She said she wanted to go. He looked at her. Without me? He asked. Without you, she said. He was quiet for a moment. He was not a man who argued with decisions he understood, and she could see that he understood this one. All right, he said, but I need 3 days to prepare some things first. He paused. And you need to understand what that room is going to be. This is not a negotiation. A man like Vane does not offer $2 million to negotiate. He is looking for something. I know what he is looking for, she said. She spent the next 2 days in the archive, not organizing. That work was done and done well. What she was doing now was different from organizing. It was closer to what her father must have done in the final weeks before the drive north, going back through everything she already knew and learning it at a depth below knowledge, the way you learn the terrain of a place you intend to defend. She was making the material part of herself so that in any room under any pressure, it would still be there. She also wrote. She sat at the work table with a legal pad and wrote the entire case out from beginning to end. The timeline, the chain of custody, the specific regulatory violations, and the statutes they violated. The names of every executive Frank Sully had identified and their roles in the decisions. The county supervisors who had signed the 2019 agreement. She wrote it all in the plain sequential language of someone who has understood something completely and is explaining it to another person. She wrote it twice. The second version was tighter, with every word that was not necessary removed. On the evening before the meeting, Corwin Alderman's truck came up the fire road. He got out carrying a plain cardboard box and climbed the slope without hurrying. He set the box down on the porch. Bread, cheese, 2 apples, a thermos of coffee, a mason jar of apple cider that turned out to be very good. He sat in the salvage chair and she sat in the other one, and they watched the dark come into the valley from the east, the stars appearing one by one as the light faded, the mountains going from shapes to presences to something felt more than seen. After a while he said, Dorothy told me the last time she came into the store that she had squared everything away, said she had done everything she could do and the rest belonged to the next generation. He paused. I didn't know what she meant at the time. Leona watched the stars. She left everything, Leona said. Every piece of it. Corwin was quiet for a moment. She was a determined woman, he said. The kind of determined that doesn't announce itself. Just keeps going regardless. He left before 10. She watched his headlights descend the fire road and go dark in the trees. Then she went inside and lay down on the cot and slept without dreaming for the first time since she had arrived. In the morning, she drove to Sacramento. The offices of Vane and Associates occupied the 15th floor of a building on K Street, the kind of building designed to communicate a specific and unmistakable message about the people who work inside it. She rode the elevator up and gave her name to the receptionist and was shown into a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the city. Chester Vane was already there. He was shorter than his voice had suggested, with the compact, deliberate physicality of a man who applies the same discipline to the gym that he applies to everything else. He stood when she entered and offered his hand and she shook it. His grip was controlled, calibrated. 2 other men were at the table, both in their 40s, both with the practiced blankness of lawyers present to observe and say nothing. She sat across from Vane. She had brought nothing with her. No bag, no folder, no document case. Just her jacket and the clothes she was wearing. Vane noted the absence. She watched him note it. He offered the tone he had prepared, reasonable and warm, the tone of a man who genuinely regrets a misunderstanding and wants to move past it. He described his company's interest in the region. He named the figure again. $2 million, cash settlement, 30-day close. She let him finish completely. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and placed a USB drive on the table between them. Vane looked at it. On that drive, she said, is a complete digital copy of an archive assembled between 2007 and 2025 by Dorothy Eleanor Calloway. The archive contains the original scientific data, investigative reporting, and whistleblower testimony from the Marsh investigation into Vidian Terra Corporation. It contains chain of custody documentation for all primary materials, establishing that none of the evidence has been altered or compromised. And it contains the Shale Pass Valley Acquisition and Development Agreement signed by your company and the Siskiyou County Board of Supervisors in 2019, including the full technical appendix. The room was very quiet. She looked at Vane. His expression had not visibly changed. Something beneath it had. Copies of that drive, she said, have been prepared and sealed in packages addressed to 6 federal agencies. The EPA Regional Office, the Department of Justice Environmental and Natural Resources Division, the FBI Field Office in Sacramento, the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, and 2 others. Those packages are currently in the custody of Breckett Holt. If I do not send a specific confirmation message to Mr. Holt by 6 o'clock this evening, those packages will be delivered tonight. She kept her voice level, not performing calm. She was calm, in the way you are calm when a decision has been made that cannot be unmade, and you have made your peace with it completely. I also want you to know, she said, that 5 days ago I met with a federal EPA investigator in Sacramento and provided her with the original county agreement and technical appendix. She has opened a formal preliminary inquiry. That process is already in motion and is not contingent on anything that happens or does not happen in this room today. Vane was looking at the USB drive on the table between them. My grandmother, Leona said, waited 15 years for this moment. She built a room underground and filled it with evidence, and she waited alone. I have had 2 weeks. She paused. I can wait 24 more hours if that is what you need, but the answer to your offer is no. The answer to every offer is no. The land is not for sale. The archive is not for sale. What is in that archive is going to reach the people who need to see it regardless of anything you do in this room or outside of it. She stood up. The only question remaining, she said, is whether your company cooperates with the federal investigation or does not. That choice is yours, and it is the only choice you have left. She picked up the USB drive and put it back in her jacket pocket. Vane said nothing. The 2 men on either side of him said nothing. The city spread out enormous and indifferent behind the glass. She walked out of the conference room and down the hall and into the elevator and pressed the lobby button. The doors closed. She stood in the descending elevator and thought about a woman who had packed a 3-year-old child into a car on a Tuesday morning in October and driven 3 days until she found a mountain no one was watching. The lobby doors opened into the afternoon. She called Breckett from the sidewalk. He picked up on the first ring. Send the message, she said. Hold the packages. A pause. Understood, he said. She stood on the K Street sidewalk in the Sacramento afternoon, the sun flat and warm, the ordinary traffic of the city moving past with its ordinary noise and urgency, people going to and from things that mattered to them, the whole ordinary momentum of a weekday afternoon. Then she drove back to the mountain. What followed did not happen in dramatic reversals. That was something she came to understand clearly in the weeks that followed, how institutional accountability accumulates, how it builds not in sudden overturnings, but in the steady and deliberate aggregation of documented fact. Breckett filed the counter-response to the fraudulent injunction. The EPA investigator opened a formal inquiry. The Department of Justice, reached through channels Breckett had maintained over 40 years of practice, began a parallel criminal review. Frank Sully surfaced 7 weeks after the meeting in Sacramento. He did not call Leona. He reached Breckett through a chain of lawyers, a contact who knew a contact who had known Breckett for 30 years. He had been living in a small town in Nevada under a different name since 2007. He had seen a legal notice in a trade publication, an obscure filing that Breckett had deliberately placed in 3 industry journals, worded in language that would mean nothing to anyone except the specific person it was designed for. He had been waiting. He had been waiting for the archive to be opened, for someone to find what had been left there, for the right person to be standing in the right place. He had been waiting for 18 years with the same patience that Dorothy had applied to her vigil on the mountain, the patience of someone who has decided that the moment will come and that when it comes, they will be ready. Leona met him once in a conference room in Reno with his attorney and Beckett present. He was 70 now, heavier than he had appeared in the tape from 2007, with the careful and slightly formal manner of a man who had spent many years being precise about everything, because the cost of imprecision had proven itself to him in the most serious way possible. He shook her hand and held it for a moment longer than a formal handshake. "Your parents," he said, "were the only people I ever met in this who were not afraid." She said, "They were a little afraid. They just went anyway." He looked at her for a moment, then he nodded slowly, with the recognition of someone hearing something true stated plainly. He had 18 years of supplementary material beyond his original testimony. Documentation he had continued to compile from a distance, monitoring Vidyan's public filings and industry reports, tracking the patterns he recognized from the inside, building a supplementary record against the day the original testimony resurfaced and needed corroboration. 18 years of a man staying careful and thorough and ready because he had made a decision that if the moment came, he was going to be fully prepared for it. The moment had come. He was ready. The federal investigation moved with the deliberateness of something that has sufficient weight and momentum and does not need to hurry. The county agreement was confirmed as a federal environmental crime within 6 weeks of the initial filing. The EPA issued formal notices of violation for the disposal sites Everett Marsh had identified and mapped, sites that field investigators now confirm were not historical but active. The Department of Justice began a criminal inquiry into the executives Frank Sully had named on tape in 2007. The communities in 4 states where the contamination had been documented were notified of the federal investigation. These were the towns Leona now knew by name from her mother's interview transcripts, from the typed pages with their handwritten corrections running into the margins. Towns where the well water had changed and the explanations had never been satisfying, and the settlements had come with paperwork that said, "You agreed not to speak about it again." Places where parents had stopped trusting what came out of the tap and then stopped trusting anyone who told them not to worry. The notifications went out on a Thursday. Beckett told her the response from those communities was immediate and was not quiet. 20 years of suppressed testimony does not stay suppressed once the door that held it opens. It moves. Chester Vane's firm withdrew from representing Vidyan in the second month of the investigation. Vane himself was referred to the State Bar Association for his role in the fraudulent injunction. His license was suspended pending the outcome of that review. Both men who had been present in the conference room with him cooperated with the federal investigation within 60 days of the initial filing. 3 executives were indicted. The chief executive officer of Vidyan's parent company was indicted. The county supervisor who had signed the 2019 agreement resigned from office and was subsequently charged separately under state law. Leona was not in Sacramento for any of it. She was on the mountain. She had understood from the beginning that the work of the investigation belonged to the investigators, and that her role had been to get the material to the people equipped to act on it, and then to trust that they would do what they were equipped to do. Beckett sent her updates. She read everything and was available for every question the federal investigators had, and there were many questions over many months. And she answered all of them with the precision she had built over weeks of living inside the archive and making its contents part of herself. But she did not go to Sacramento to watch. She stayed on the mountain and she worked. The shack had good bones. That was what Corwin said the first time he came up and assessed it seriously. Walking the perimeter, checking the foundation, examining the roof line with the eye of someone who had been maintaining structures in mountain conditions for 50 years. "Good bones," he said. "The rod is all surface, the walls are true." They replaced the roof in sections over 3 weekends. Corwin and his son-in-law Aldrich, a quiet and competent man who knew what he was doing with a hammer and did not need to be asked to do things twice. Leona worked alongside them and learned from watching and then doing, the way competence is actually acquired and retained. She rebuilt the porch herself. She tore the rotted decking out down to the joists and found the joists still solid, old-growth timber cut to last. She sourced new decking from a salvage yard in Eureka and fitted it board by board, setting each one with the attention of someone who understands that what they are building will outlast them and that this is a good reason to do it well. The interior she did in order. Floor first, then walls, insulation, windows. She worked through the winter months with a consistency that was the closest thing to peace she had known in her life. Not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of purpose. the specific satisfaction of work that is necessary and is being done correctly. Below ground, the archive stayed intact and organized. Its contents now duplicated in 3 federal agencies and 2 university libraries that had agreed to maintain the research record permanently. But the archive itself remained as Dorothy had built it, a complete original record, the physical embodiment of 15 years of patience and love and careful, solitary work. She unsealed it in the legal sense. She filed documentation with the County Historical Records Office, identifying the archive and its contents as a private collection of public interest materials, properly described and properly preserved. Beckett had taken a day to think about this and then said it was the right thing to do. It stops being a secret, he said, and that is exactly what it needs to stop being. One morning in September, 4 months after she had stepped off the bus in Shale Pass with 2 duffel bags and $411 and a brass key she did not yet know how to use, she was sitting on the finished porch with coffee when she heard Corwin's truck on the fire road. He came up the slope and stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at the work for a moment. "That's a solid porch," he said. "It'll hold," she said. He sat in the second chair. They drank coffee and looked out at the valley below, the morning light moving through the trees, the mountains blue and clear on the horizon. After a while, he said, "Couple of the families on the North Ridge are talking about putting in a road access project. County's going to lose the Vidian development money, and there's federal infrastructure funding available for rural areas." He paused. "It'd bring the fire road up to proper standard. Might even get power lines up here inside of 2 years." She looked at the valley. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He nodded as if this was information he had already arrived at on his own and was glad to have confirmed. The morning after he had gone back down, she pulled out the leather log Dorothy had kept. The first thing she had found beneath the floorboard in the shack. The beginning of everything. She had read it through completely by now and understood every entry. Knew the full record of what had been built here from 2007 to 2009. The 2 years of careful, solitary, cash-paid construction that had produced the thing below her feet. She turned to the last written page. Dorothy's final entry was dated 3 weeks before she died. "The porch is holding. The roof has one loose shingle on the east slope that I cannot reach safely. The hatch seal is good. The archive is intact. Everything is in order. I have done everything I can do. The rest belongs to her." Leona sat with the log in her lap for a long time. Then she took a pencil from her jacket pocket and turned to the first blank page after Dorothy's last entry. She wrote the date. "Archive verified and complete," she wrote. "Evidence transmitted to federal authorities. Investigation ongoing. Porch rebuilt to last. Roof solid. Loose shingle on the east slope has been replaced." She paused. She thought about what else needed to be said. "The land is mine," she wrote. "I am staying." She thought about the communities in 4 states who had been told finally, after 20 years of being told otherwise, that what they knew had actually happened, and that they were not alone in it. She thought about her father tracing a chemical signature through water tables across state lines because he believed the work mattered. She thought about her mother on the other side of a table from Frank Sully, in a room with a single lamp, asking the questions that needed to be asked with the patience that did not waver. She thought about Dorothy, who had built this room and filled it, and waited for her without ever being certain she would come. She added one more line. "Dorothy," she wrote, "I found it. I used it. Thank you." She closed the log and set it on the arm of the chair and picked up her coffee and looked out at the valley below, where the morning light was moving through the pines in long, slow columns, the way it had been moving through those pines for longer than anyone had been alive to see it. The mountains in the distance doing what mountains do, which is nothing urgent, and everything necessary, and endure. The brass key was in her jacket pocket. It had been in her jacket pocket every day since she arrived, the way some people carry a particular stone from a particular place. Not as a symbol, but as a fact. Something real and weighted that connects the hand holding it to the hands that held it before. She turned it over once between her fingers. Then she put it back in her pocket and finished her coffee and went to work.